Okay, you guys, gonna go over some of the elementary principles of composition from this beauty of a book. Now, this is a book that has been used for a long time in college classes, and I think that there is still a lot of value here. It's designed to help you with your academic writing, and particularly in terms of style and tone. So I don't want you to spend too much time if the language is too abstract for you. But there are definitely some things I'm going to point to in this video that I would like you to think about and try to implement in your writing. Some of it is repeated in Zinsser on Writing Well, and for my taste, I find Zinsser to be a better writer, but this is a classic, and we're going to go over some of the useful elements in this second chapter entitled Elementary Principles of Composition. So the first thing is choose a suitable design and hold to it. This is very helpful, and I mentioned this in my last video, that formatting your writing gives your reader a lot of confidence. Instead of just being confronted with just sentences that are kind of randomly stitched together, even just a simple heading can give your reader a sense that the writer values my time, they're trying to make it accessible for me, and we need to capture their attention, so we want to make sure that we provide them with the structure so that they can figure out what it is we're trying to say. So this is one thing that they do well is William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White do a good job of creating a design for the book. So there's chapters, and then there are sections. And in section 12, they begin, a basic structural design underlies every kind of writing. Writers will in part follow this design, in part deviate from it, according to their skills, their needs, and the unexpected events that accompany the act of composition. Writing, to be effective, must follow closely the thoughts of the writer, but not necessarily in the order in which those thoughts occur. And this is why revision is so important. And some of you in your essays, I saw sort of a stream of consciousness style of writing, which was good insofar as you got your points across, but by reordering the way your thoughts are organized, you could be more effective. And so that's why I provide in your assignment details some structure for your introduction, for the body paragraphs, and for the conclusion, because that's a tried and true design for the shorter form essays that allows the reader to kind of grasp what your intention is and to quickly identify your thesis statement and then to move on to your argument. They continue, they say, in most cases, planning must be a deliberate prelude to writing. And that's why I suggest using that template and outlining. The first principle of composition, therefore, is to foresee or determine the shape of what is to come and pursue that shape. Section 13 says, make the paragraph the unit of composition. And I've certainly tried to stress that with the outline suggestion. And starting with the body paragraphs, you're going to have about 4 body paragraphs, an introduction and a conclusion. And writing the body paragraphs first will make the introduction easier to achieve, since your thesis statement really needs to point to the argumentation you're going to make in the subsequent paragraphs, right? So if the thesis statement is a map of your essay, you need to have written the essay first. You can't write the map first and then write the essay. You need to make your arguments and then tie them together in the introduction. On page 16, they say, ordinarily, however, a subject requires division into topics, each of which should be dealt with in a paragraph. And that, usually you begin your paragraph with a topic sentence, and that guides the reader to see, okay, this is where we're at, this is what the writer is going to discuss, and it gives you an orientation into reading that paragraph. This they mention further down the page when they say, as a rule, begin each paragraph either with a sentence that suggests the topic or with a sentence that helps the transition. It's also important to provide transition from paragraph to paragraph. Even in these academic essays, remember, we want to be speaking to people. And that means having a conversational transition from one topic to the next. The bottom of page 17 points to the visual aspect of paragraphs. They write, in general, remember that paragraphing calls for a good eye as well as a logical mind. Enormous blocks of print look formidable to readers who are often reluctant to tackle them. Therefore, breaking long paragraphs in two, even if it is not necessary to do so for sense, meaning, or logical development, is often a visual help. But remember, too, that firing off many short paragraphs in quick succession can be distracting. Paragraph breaks used only for show read like the writing of commerce or of display advertising. Moderation and a sense of order should be the main considerations in paragraphing. And so it's a judgment call. Too many paragraph breaks can be disruptive. Not enough paragraph breaks can be tiring. You want your paragraphs to be ordered around a central idea. The next section is probably the most famous section of this book. Section 14 deals with using the active voice. And really, to get a sense of what the active voice is, it's best to read their examples. But in the active voice, your subject is performing the action. It's not being acted upon. So their first example is, I shall always remember my first visit to Boston. In that sentence, I am the subject, and I shall always remember my first visit to Boston. The passive construction could have been, my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me. And that's making the visit the subject instead of the person. So oftentimes, now I don't want to bog you down with grammar, but grammar is very important. And the simpler your grammatical constructions, the easier your reader's going to have it. So usually you want to start with your subject and then move to your predicate. And you want to keep your modifiers close to the things they modify. So for active voice, starting with the subject and moving on to the predicate usually avoids falling into passive voice. Let's look at another example. Let's see. There were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. So what's the subject in that sentence? there is not a very concrete subject. So if you change the sentence from there were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground to dead leaves covered the ground, now dead leaves becomes the subject and the action is covering the ground. Next example, at dawn the crowing of a rooster could be heard. Well, what's the subject? It's a little confusing. The crowing of a rooster is the subject, and could be heard is the predicate. But if you rearrange it to the cock's crow came with dawn, then you have very clearly the subject, the cock's crow, and the predicate came with dawn. Next example, the reason he left college was that his health became impaired. In this sentence, the subject is the reason he left college, and the predicate was that his health became impaired. You could rearrange that or rewrite that as failing health compelled him to leave college. In that example, failing health is the subject, and its action is compelling him to leave college. So the basic pattern is being clear about what your subject is and putting it first and using a good verb to engage the reader with the action, what the predicate is. Read through, think through, look for the passive voice construction in your writing. It's not a steadfast rule that you can't use passive voice. In fact, they even give one example where it would make sense to use the passive voice when they write, "The dramatists of the Restoration are little esteemed today." If you rewrote that as modern readers have little esteem for the dramatists of the Restoration, you'd be putting the emphasis on the modern readers and not on the dramatists of the Restoration, which is really the subject of the sentence. So there are cases where passive voice is going to work better. It's a judgment call. But in general, you're going to want to think about whether or not you're using the active or passive voice. Related to that is putting statements in a positive form. We want to make definite assertions, is what they say. So their examples are, he was not very often on time, is indefinite. But if you say, he usually came late, then it's just more clear and forceful in the writing. So this is related to active or passive voice, positive form. Using the negative form doesn't give us the image of what you're trying to show us. It gives us an abstract idea of what you're not trying to show us. So put things in a positive form. Section 16, use definite, specific, concrete language. This is also a similar idea, that by making things specific and concrete, we're able to see it better than the abstract idea that you're trying to prove. Especially in this article where you're going to be proving your argument using fact. You're going to use a lot of specific details. Omit needless words. This dovetails with Zinsser's ideas. Avoid a succession of loose sentences. You want to make your writing varied but tight. We're not writing fiction. We're not trying to engage a sense of lyricism. We're trying to argue facts. So we want to have clear, short, declarative sentences where it's very obvious what the subject is and what the predicate is. That's the main thing I wanted to get to. Although section 20 talks about keeping related words together. And so the order of where you put things in a sentence really matters a lot. You want to keep the modifiers next to the thing they're modifying. You also, right, so it was a dark night, as opposed to it was a night where everyone saw that it was dark. You don't separate the modifier from the thing modified. Put your adjectives, your adverbs right next to the thing they're trying to modify. Otherwise, you can create some confusing and embarrassing, unclear sentences. One thing I did want to point out is this idea in section 21 of tense related to summaries. The main thing is you want to keep your tense consistent. You don't want to be switching back and forth between present and past tense. And since you're going to be writing about articles, you're going to write about them in the present tense. So, for example, you're going to say, such and such author states, houseplants can be conducive to mental health because learning to care for something gives people a sense of pride and satisfaction, end quote. Something like that, right? So you're going to use the present tense because you're summarizing an article. And that's really all I wanted you to get from this week's reading of Elements of Style, Elementary Principles of Composition. As you start to get more advanced in your writing, you're going to want to include in your thought process some of these ideas, such as, I also think it's a good way if you're feeling stuck at all. Because sometimes when you're feeling stuck, it's because you have a sort of formal problem that you're not addressing effectively. So if you are stuck at a certain point in your writing, think, okay, what's the next subject I'm going to cover? And what is that subject going to do? Every sentence has a subject and a predicate. Starting with the subject makes it easy to be clear and to have active voice. So instead of just writing your thoughts, think about what you're going to write and put the subject first and then the predicate. You can vary it up when you revise, but when you're drafting, try to work in that process where your sentences are clearly structured with the subject followed by the predicate and the modifiers next to the words they modify. We don't need to be fancy in these essays. We need to be clear. And so that is going to help you to achieve clarity. I hope that helps. Email me with any questions. Stop into my Zoom office hours for conversation. And